Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Through Conversations podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Rachel Armstrong. Rachel is a professor of experimental architecture at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape in Newcastle University, United Kingdom. Rachel's career is characterized by design thinking as a fusion element for interdisciplinary expertise. Exploring the transition from an industrial era of architectural design to an ecological one, Rachel pioneers an ecological, technological, and humanistic practice called living architecture that considers the implications of designing and engineering in a world thrown off balance. In this episode, we covered a lot of ground, from design thinking to architecture, innovation, what is innovation for, artificial intelligence, the future of humanity as an interplanetary species, reconnecting the concrete jungle with the natural one, the cities of the future, and much more. If you like this conversation, please share it with your loved ones and let me know in the reviews. I truly appreciate all of your support. With you, Rachel Armstrong. So welcome to this edition of Through Conversations podcast. I'm here with Rachel Armstrong, and I'm very excited to have this conversation. We've been off balance during this crisis, and I'm hoping that this conversation help us to readapt and create new balances. So Rachel, tell us just a bit about yourself. How did you become involved in architecture, and what are your thoughts about what's happening?
Yeah, it's a strange time for sure, and I would say that that's the way the world likes it. My background is actually in medicine, but I remember when I was a little kid, I used to like designing worlds in jam jars, and I was trying to figure out, how lots of different kinds of creatures can get along. It was like little gardens. And from that time, I really thought of life, not just the creatures I was dealing with, but the soil and, the whole environment. Was a place for storytelling, was a place for design, was a place for thinking. And I've always liked thinking along with living processes. So since I was really, really small. And when I went to university, we didn't have anything like synthetic biology. There was no discipline that brought together biology and design. So I actually started off in the field of medicine because it was the nearest I could get to thinking about how we could think about biology and thinking about, what it meant to be in a body and, what we could do with that. And so whilst I was practicing medicine, I went on a sabbatical to India where I worked on a leprosy colony. And I got to see lots of different kinds of medicine practiced in India, but the leprosy colony was the one that really opened my eyes because people that had been outcast by their communities because of their illness and therefore they no longer had a life. They were really left to die. And they had banded together and they had beaten the ground into fertility with their bare hands. And created an environment in which they could reconfigure their world around their needs. And when I went there, it was about 40 years after the institution had been established. And it was a small village that had machines that allowed people that had lost fingers and thumbs to be able to work with machines with very low mechanical advantages. And so they could actually start to do productive work, make things, and sell them to the nearby city of Pune. They'd also reconfigured the domestic spaces so that the cooking ranges, for example, had pots and pans with handles that were about 1 meter long so that people wouldn't burn themselves inadvertently. And then there was a medical clinic that had been set up where I was working with a hand surgeon who was really rethreading tendons. And the reason you could do surgery in the middle of nowhere in particular, was because the body, when it's anesthetic, doesn't need complicated breathing devices to put people to sleep. You can actually operate on someone's hand and take non-dominant tendons from the fingers and transpose them into the thumb, so that somebody who can't grip now with a small operation can actually use their thumb. And you can also ask them, whilst they're having their surgery, whether it works. So you can ask them to move their thumb, but you actually ask them to move their finger, and then they move their thumb. So there's this rehabilitation process that goes on where the person had to relearn their body. They had to relearn that thinking about their finger was actually thinking about their thumb. And for those that had their chewing muscles, their masseter muscles, rethreaded around their eye so that they didn't go blind when they lost their blink reflex. So you give someone some chewing gum and some dark glasses, and as they chew, they blink their eye.
Wow.
So you can keep the eye moist for much longer so they don't lose their eyesight. So these rewired bodies, very simple changes, massive alterations in the quality of what they're able to do. And then this complete reconfiguring of a world where, the activities of daily living were transformed, not around a broken body, but a body that had found a place for itself in the world, and alongside other kinds of bodies. So for me, once I'd worked in this environment, I couldn't unsee the potential for new relationships, the potential for rethinking our assumptions about biology, technology, environment, and then space, because it was that was the time really when architectural agendas, the spatial, the material, and the temporal, the social, all kind of came together and made most sense to me. So I then started looking for ways of expanding that knowledge. I knew that it didn't exist within medicine. So I started working with artists. So my first artist collaboration was a wonderful woman, Helen Chadwick, who was working with biological materials in her work. So she did, casts of urine, which she likened to flowers, with male and female elements, and took tissues from her body to create viral landscapes during the time of HIV. So my whole world was turned upside down, inside out, and there was no way that I didn't want to incorporate this way of seeing. I didn't see myself as the virtuoso here. I didn't see myself as the designer or as the artist. I saw myself as an inherent collaborator, a kind of mischief maker, thinking about possibilities, working with teams, having incredible conversations that sounded like something out of the science fiction plot. And then by the time I came across Neil Spiller at the Virtual Futures conferences, which were held in the mid-1990s, working then with architectural agendas was almost like, yes, well, of course, that is what I now do, because it all made a lot of sense. So if I'd come across a more traditional architectural school that really looked at building performance and concrete constructions and geometry, I possibly wouldn't have moved into architecture. But because I came across Neil Spiller, Peter Cook, Stephen Gage, the wonderful world of architecture was like science fiction come true, in which someone with a medical knowledge and a knowledge of, call it, a digitalization of the body, which had been happening in medicine, where the body was being scanned and invaded by the digital gaze in a way that previously hadn't occurred, it felt like a very a creative place to be. And once that Pandora's box was open, I wanted to use the things that I knew in order to create more opportunities for architecture students, create projects with designers, and actually introduce more science and cutting edge technologies into the way that we thought about space and materials. And the big thing for me was really, when architecture had started to use metaphors of buildings as though they were bodies. The idea then of kind of literally transposing medical insights, the biological fascination that I'd had, since I was a kid, but actually into the origins of life sciences. How could I actually start to generate tools, technologies, installations, conversations that started to expand the spaces that we inhabited? So in some ways, they started to approximate more like the leprosy colony in Pune, where actually everything had been reconfigured. There were new rules now for living, and actually the space that you inhabited was also alive. So really that's been the journey. Things like, what is aliveness? What are the ethics of this? What are the politics? Because we use language that assumes certain things about the living world. So for example, biology has a Greek root that assumes a political existence. So in other words, bios implies some rights. Whereas Zoe, the term that's used for bare life or the life of animals, doesn't. And then, of course, we have the whole realm of minerals, which Carl Linnaeus was using a language to describe that they had a life too. So he thought that rocks and soils and kind of ground accreted and grew, not in the same way that organisms did, but through some kind of geological process that he used the language of life on. And so this idea of, how far we have habituated ourselves to ideas about the living world that are giving us blind spots in our thinking and practice has really been the subject of my inquiry. So on one hand, it's a conceptual practice that says, okay, so in a world that is wrecked by ecocide, the way that we've been going around dealing with the living world has created a lot of damage, maybe not intentionally, but through our blind spots, our neglect, our oversights, we have failed to see things that we should have seen and made remedial actions much earlier for. So given this scenario, are there different frameworks that we can actually use for practice? So the other part of my work is not just the conceptual, but also the practical tools. So, okay, if we are going to start thinking about spaces as actually having some kind of inner life, whether that is very literal by thinking about the microbes in our spaces, or whether it is more metaphorical, or whether it is indicative of new forms of life like artificial intelligence and smart technologies or biodigital interfaces. What kinds of care, consideration, configuring and difficulties do we become presented with? Because I think the other thing about this is that this isn't really, and it shouldn't be about out with the old, in with the new, but really staying present with the change and figuring out where we need to respond in a timely way. So we need to be present, with our design decisions, with our inventions. We need to really, consider the ethics and make that an ongoing dialogue, and not just say, okay, this thing is fine forever. We need to go back, with the knowledge of our explorations and discoveries, and, kind of reevaluate the things that we've been doing, and, agree amongst ourselves whether these are the right things to do or not. And I think particularly when you're working in extremely complex spaces, such as, the complexity that comes with living things, then there are no simple decisions. And if you've got a universal constant or a simple decision that you're holding on to, I personally would advise, to reevaluate it and have a look and see if it is so reliable and simple after all.
Wow.
So yeah, so essentially that's the trajectory, and so out of that has come a whole bunch of, let's call it unconventional architectural projects.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I use the term architecture, I don't mean, you know, I'm not a practicing and qualified architect. So I'm not a professional architect. I am someone who is an architectural thinker, in the sense that I'm interested in the choreography of space, matter, and time. I come with an alternative knowledge set than would come with a formal professional architectural training. And in that sense, I see myself as having a great deal of complementarity for people that are professional architects. So there isn't really any conflict. It's more of a way of having a dialogue, bringing together different tool sets and ideas, and actually enjoying the difference and enjoying the different levels of expectations and different skills that myself and my collaborators can actually bring to some of the projects.
Wow, it's quite a journey, Rachel, and it's something to learn from, because you've taken your personal experiences and your background and decided to pour it out to the world and actually make an impact, a tangible impact within our societies and in the foreseeable future for generations to come, which is mind-blowing. And there are so many things which you touch upon right now that just blow my mind, in the sense that I used to think that architecture was an orthodoxy where, my friends would go and study architecture and they would be a square, right? They would have to have a line of framework thinking, and that's the way it should be. And we have to keep passing the baton in the designs we do that were from the past. But it's different. Architecture is, as you say, it's quite a metaphor to think that our internal mindsets, our philosophies, our abstractions can come into fruition and come in and affect other people's lives. So how do you think of architecture in the 21st century, and what do you think our cities, the way we've built our societies, tell about ourselves? What do you think of that?
So I think you guys are standing on the cusp of an era of architectural innovation. And I think in order to think about the 21st century, we need to briefly reflect on architecture for the 20th and 19th century.
Yes.
So our architectural philosophy, and every discipline has a philosophy, the convention of architectural philosophy is grounded in industrial practice. So modern architectural practice comes out of the need for new types of buildings, railway stations, massive bridges, tall buildings. So all of the skills that 20th century architects developed were really conducive with a particular worldview of industrialization. So towards the end of the 20th century, various kind of findings and insights into the way that industrial society is impacting, both human communities and the living world, yes, made it absolutely imperative that we adopted different kinds of ways of practicing architecture. Now, however, in 20th century architecture, it is not just the theory that is holding architects in a particular kind of worldview. It is also the economics. And so I think one of the really interesting things that your generation will have to think through is actually not just a philosophy, but an economics for architectural practice, and go back to first principles to think what constitutes an architecture. So winding to first to the 21st century then, so if our goal in the 21st century is to stimulate planetary re-enlivening after industrialization has stripped it of natural resources, abused its populations, poisoned its environment, there's a complete reconfiguring of what architecture can and should be So there's an ethical dimension to it. There's lots of cans. I mean, we could develop huge arcs, so Buckminster Fuller scale city domes in which we try to reconstitute worlds of our own making, of our own design. But there's another possibility, which is actually working with the world as it is, so that the practice of architecture itself is something that increases the liveliness, increases the fertility, increases even the kind of the joy and the character of a space, rather than controlling and subordinating it to a human intent. And for that, then, one has to think about anthropocentrism. And if we are going to be designing environments that are in themselves supporting the everyday activities of life, including breathing, eating, living along with our non-human companions, then we need to think beyond the human animal as to what the construction of a fertile, kind of joyful place could be. And that might mean that the form of architecture in which the architect is at the apex of the pyramid, representing the domination of humankind over all other species and resources on the planet, needs to change. Yes. Maybe we have more horizontal ways of choreographing material effects. Maybe the types of building, in inverted commas, that arise from those new relations don't look like the squares and blocks that you've just mentioned. Mm-hmm. They look very different. They might look like a wetlands with undulating spaces that actually are inhabited by maybe not just humans, but also human companions, or non-human human companions. Or they may actually be generated for non-humans in themselves. The idea of actually making space for nature as a fundamental architectural pursuit that does not just privilege the anthropos, the human, as a figure at the center of all things. So a lot of that requires a lot of rethinking. It requires experimentation, it requires ethical engagement, and it requires a radically interdisciplinary approach, because we need to figure out what actually works, what's possible. And I think at the heart of this really is not really just thinking about shapes and nature and valorizing notions of the biological, but actually reconfiguring what a viable ecosystem is, and the economics. Or let's go back to the idea of the ecos as the home. So if we are homemaking through the ecos, and the ecos has an economics that allows kin and community and families to live together, then what are those basic forms of exchanges that our spaces need to afford, to support, and to promote? So then, what are the materials? What are the infrastructures? What are the densities of co-inhabiting kin and, families that actually can occupy that space? And what is the carrying capacity of those spaces? What we don't want is, really to start to assume that certain kinds of spaces are self-sustaining. We actually need to build in the regenerative capacity of inhabited space. And with that, we need to cover a subject that modernity hates, which is death, decay, decomposition. Yes. And that is a generative, active practice which has been, adopted through agricultural practices, since, the Neolithic times. And so, not just abandoning waste to garbage patches and throwing it in places that are away from where we live, but actually saying, hey, we have this stuff. How does this have another life? How is this reconfigured by the way we live? How do we value this process? How do we incorporate this into our oikonomics, so that maybe not every space has the same oikonomy, and maybe actually different spaces have economies that have certain dominant forms of exchange, which makes them have tradable capacities with other economies, which may be nearby, they may be far away, but the ethical values then that say, hey, we can trade with someone much further away because we are valorizing, let's say, maybe even a digital exchange, but that digital exchange is using forms of energy and maybe even biodegradable electronic materials themselves, so semiconductors that are organic, forms of computing that aren't necessarily the digital we knew in the 20th century. So that there are different kinds of tools. So I think that, let's say, a more life-promoting existence isn't necessarily back to hair shirt forms of technology and practices, doing without, scaling down, and living a very minimalist existence. It's more about understanding what your limits and freedoms are and working really creatively with that, and working with others that share your values and share share a kind of vision, for a world transformed, and a legacy that we can be proud of for those that come after us.
Yes, the legacy and vision, those two ideas, just the notion that we are permanent keeps permeating our cities, our societies, and the way we unfold as human beings in this existence. And we forget that life is a cycle, as you mentioned. Life constitutes being born and living and then dying. And the notion that our buildings will be our heritage to our new generations, what will it tell about ourselves? This concrete jungle being isolated from nature, from the jungle, the real jungle. So it is very interesting to think that one day we can see the building become a living systems, our living spaces, our offices, our rooms can become something more than just isolated things, isolated places where we flourish. Why can't we flourish and keep flourishing with nature by our side? Right?
I absolutely agree with this. And I think also to make that transition, there's a mindset transition, which is really about what do our buildings want, whatever it is, whatever form that they take. So that this isn't just about exploitation. We can't keep just taking with us this colonial idea that, we are at the top of the pyramid and that everything beneath us, deserves to be imposed upon, and that we extend no care or reciprocity with them.
Exactly.
And so that by kind of understanding how a space may become lively from first principles, whether that is that you understand that there is a very basic chemical or mineral metabolism, so things like the titanium oxides that can, metabolize, pollutants in the atmosphere, and they change color, they can become tarnished, and then you have to replenish them because they become tarnished. So there's a kind of, even though that surface isn't alive, there's a lively quality to it that requires us to look after it in some ways. And then we can think about, well, what if things are slightly more lively? What if we actually have, plants within our environment? What is the relationship of gardening care that we afford to these beings? How often do we look after them? Or do we actually design systems that help us do that? We might also think of, microbial species. And that's one of the things that I've been working with recently in the Living Architecture project, creating bioreactors where we don't inflict the raiment of hygiene on our spaces and kill everything that isn't human, because we are control freaks and paranoid about, the non-human coming into our home and uninvited, like rats. And, so, I mean, there's a huge ethics about what is it that allows something to come into our space? I mean, we let dogs come in, but rats not so much. Some people actually like rats and keep them as pets. So there isn't a kind of, let's say, simple algorithm that says, this out, that in. And there's something about the way that we treat the world So some people won't kill mosquitoes. Others, don't mind so much if they get zapped. Because people have different spiritual beliefs, and they have different levels of engagement with the different life of the natural world, the different kinds of life within the natural world. So how we choreograph and how we arrange that according to our own belief and value systems, really, really important. And so in the modern Western world, we've had this idea of the reign of hygiene, that white sterile spaces, and the idea of having bioprocessors really confronts us with the idea that we make waste. But actually, we don't have to have them ugly. We can design them in ways where there is let's say, a performative and even aesthetic quality about them. You don't have to look at the nasty brown bits. You could valorize ceramic casing because, nasty brown stuff doesn't need light. It doesn't need to be seen. So you could have more of a Gaudi-esque kind of kitchen, where ceramic mosaics are hiding, metabolic engines of anaerobic decay and the production of vital compounds like electrons for electricity in the home, or cleaned water and things. So it's really, again, thinking about the appropriateness about how do you design along with certain communities that are coexisting. And that's why it's important to think about the non-human and even the material components as being, part of that ecosystem, because materials perform work too, and it becomes part of the housework. So in the same way you can have a house economics or economics, you can also have a home that isn't just about you going around cleaning bits, but actually the home is performing useful work, not just maybe for the humans in the space, but maybe for other agents that co-inhabit as your domestic community. And so expanding some of our notions about who we live alongside, how we care for them, and what choices then does that engender, and what duration these relationships exist over. And it may be that if our homes have a kind of cyclicity and temporality to them, there may be grieving and mourning and loss. We may need to design rituals for letting go. These aren't things that we normally associate with a domestic existence, and yet everybody within their household has had some kind of loss, whether it's a pet, whether it's a loved one, whether it's even a favorite piece of furniture. When we are attached to things, and we can afford attachments to things that aren't just people. And it doesn't mean that we value them over people. It just means that they have a particular kind of value to us that we respect and we cherish and we want to celebrate. Yeah. So I think that there are qualities of living that I think that when we're going through the design school curriculum, that we can't just assume that every design drawing should just be this inert space with great aesthetic qualities. You might pay attention to light, you might pay attention to natural ventilation, you might pay attention to certain kinds of materials, but the quality of life that is afforded in that space, and what kinds of permissions and what kinds of affordances that the space invites. So how much water can be in the space, and what kind of water, and what does that afford? Does that mean that we can actually start growing mosses on the wall indoors? Does it mean that actually we have, microbial systems that are actually detecting things like pollution and letting us know through color change that there are pollutants around, so we can redirect the ventilation system or open windows, that our spaces can actually speak to us in non-human terms, and we would recognize those as maybe acts of design, but not initiated by humans. Because there's a kind of programming and a reciprocity involved in the change of quality of spaces. So I think for the 21st century, there are a lot of questions that currently aren't on the current curriculum, that even if there was a term through which your generation were exposed to discussing and thinking about, I think it would be incredibly empowering, because it could sow the seeds for your own exploration, whether that was in academia, or whether actually that is through your own practice, and providing you with a resilience in terms of your own thinking about whatever this planet has to throw at you, whether those are kind of economic challenges, material challenges, societal challenges, ecocidal challenges. I mean, all of these things could be thrown at us. And with a very narrow curriculum and a very narrow tool set for responding to a world that is rapidly changing, or it's very dynamic right now, without expanding that tool set, we're going to limit ourselves to a lot of frustration and potentially despair. So I think the enriching at the point of the curriculum, enriching in terms of learning how to, what is an architectural experiment? How do you set one up? How do you validate it? How do you perpetuate it? How do you carry that with you into the world? The learning with it, or the partnerships that you might have formed in the process. So I think that there are forms of empowerment for architectural, young designers that we're not making the most of right now. Yeah. But I think that you guys are in a place where really you could be, within a relatively short space of time, reconfiguring what architecture is and how you go about practicing that.
Definitely. And it seems that now we're waking up to a long nap, right? Everything was very stable, and we knew our roles, and every career had its own approach. But now it seems that it is evident that we can't forget that we live in a complex system, and there is constant feedback between careers, between systems outside careers, the nature and concrete, buildings, politics, economics. It's a constant feedback loop, and we're approaching into one of the more artificial ages. We're approaching into. I would like to ask you, how do you think of when someone says technology? But before that, I wanted to mention that we're approaching a time where everything seems synthetic, right? And now, given the pandemic, it seems that we're staying more and more away from microbes, right? So how can we reshift our leaders' narrative and our collective narrative that says microbes are our enemy, our invisible enemy, we should stay away from them and use sanitizer all the time, but approach them in a way that we can have reciprocity with them?
Right. So this is a very, very good question, because I think that the late 20th century has, let's say, valorized and infected us with this idea of innovation, which effectively is a kind of productization on speed. That the turnover rates for taking something from idea to product and entering into the marketplace, the neoliberal frameworks that have intensified and valorized that, have really constrained our thinking in terms of how we go about addressing some of the challenges that we're facing. And so what it's done is it's given us a very, let's call it a very narrow tool set and a very directed way of thinking. It takes ages to, let's say, consider a spectrum of alternatives and think about, actually, do I need to make something out of metal, or are there other materials? And so that I think that the process of invention and thinking about how you might reconfigure things is a kind of a long life experience. That you get to understand what you can do, you get to understand how to transgress your limits, you get to study how you can work with other people and kind of learn a lot from that. So the process isn't really about rushing to the next object that creates a you know, maybe it's a bit easier to use or it's a bit faster, but it's all still very much within the same genre. And we've come to learn that technology is something that, first of all, is pretty much something that humans do. And then there's a particular kind of technology, which is now it's smart technology. It's a kind of a digital or a machine-based contraption, a gadget, lots of words for them. But it's that kind of thing that's a technology. Yeah. And yet, if you look back to the beginning of life, you will find that nature itself has technologies. So, for example, you could consider bacteriophages, which are viruses that infect bacteria with genetic sequences to, you know, exploit them. Bacteria go, hang on, there's a nice genetic code here. Oh, I'll use that for something. And so the way that bacteria kind of use genetic information is a kind of technological strategy. And microbes are really good at using what we would think of cellular systems for conducting work. And they're much more robust than we are. You know, our multicellular organization in some ways has constrained our biology in an extent that, you know, some of the microbes really haven't been. So in some ways, if we look to nature for suggestions about how we might perform certain kinds of work, and then we also ask about what kinds of work we want to be performing. Yeah. So for example, is the kind of work we want to be performing the kind of work that makes the planet livelier? Because if it is, then we need to be looking at the technology of soil, right? Because soil is one of those systems, highly complex, made up of lots of different interacting agents. It's not an organism as we would define it right now, but it could be a hyperobject and a system that's incredibly complex, a bit like you know, an internet or an artificial intelligence system, but highly material with loads of different algorithms, let's say, you know, worms and beetles and you know, microbes in it that are all working. And I think William Bryant Logan says that I think it's a hectare of land performs a horsepower of work every day. So work in terms of metabolic work and in terms of the work of fertility, because fertility doesn't just happen, it's invested in and it's developed. Yeah. That's performed by nature. That's a form of work. So we have valorized particular kinds of work and we say, well, machines do that. And digital systems and artificial intelligence helps us achieve that kind of work much faster than we've ever done before. But if we're going to expand the portfolio of the kinds of work that you know, humanity facilitates, then actually we need to look to more natural systems to think about, okay, if nature wants to construct a material, how does it go about this? And how might we actually work along with that rather than just harvesting it, yeah, grinding it up and processing it so it stays dead? Can we keep the inherent liveliness in that system going so that we have a positive impact on a setting? And can we actually make the work more like gardening so that we're working at a meta level in technology and not always, you know, at the rock face? And we're doing that with artificial intelligence. You know, part of our anxieties about artificial intelligence is because we are working at a meta level with artificial intelligence, and we're trying to read it now because there's lots of gaps in what artificial intelligence does that we're trying to figure out how it got there. But nature's like that too. Yeah. So you know, we don't have to understand all the technology of an engine in order to drive a car. And I think that's the same with nature. But when we do, we can actually really think about how these things can be reconfigured. So for example, sewage treatment plants. Whoa, a lot of work going on there. No. If we think about that differently, can we start to use these as what we would industrially call factories, right? So that we could get different kinds of biomolecules out of it. We could use them for cleaning processes. We could maybe use them to trap plastic particles in the water. And if we didn't think about these as centralized sources, but located them within the home, maybe we would get much less toxic waste going into the environment. From then we try and scrabble around and reclaim it. So can we perform this work of recycling and reclamation and transformation much closer to the source of its consumption? And consumption in itself is not a bad thing. We all have to consume molecules to live. The question is really how we develop those ecosystems of exchange, how we respect and kind of understand them, so that we don't keep trashing their limits and we don't start, robbing from other systems, but we're kind of at least considerate. That doesn't mean that we don't factor change. We need to factor change, but that we pay attention to what's happening, so we know how then to bring in, your next set of responses, which could be considered technology. So I think technology, in a sense, has had a high cultural load, very tightly shaped by the Industrial Revolution, high modernity, the digital and artificial intelligence, really following this idea that, the transhumanist agenda where, that we one day will transcend the human and become more godlike. Potentially, Marvin Minsky-esque, the machine is our successor. I'm not someone who subscribes to that. I quite like what Bruno Latour is talking about right now, the kind of the Gaia, not as this, let's call it as a hippie kind of, God, but more as this, more in terms of its ontology as a very complicated female Greek monster that was as bad as it was good. It's a highly controversial figure. And the mythology of Gaia, when you look back at the Greek sources, it actually feels kind of much more conducive with the planet that we're living on than any ideal notion of some kind of utopia. So I like the Latour's Gaia, because she feels like a lot of trouble, and it feels like we can't take her for granted, because she's going to misbehave on her own terms if we do. So there is the work of Gaia, and someone like Latour would really kind of invite us to be earthbound again. So in terms of earth, the human related to humus, producing the work of the fertile earth, and really, the relationship between human, soil, and let's call it the planet, ends up being something that is productive and, in its kind of, let's say, most vernacular term, sustainable. Because it has this idea that we appreciate, the legacy that we leave, which is our organic molecules. So I think that ideas about technology will change, and they'll change through disciplines like synthetic biology, the biotechnologies, molecular biology, microbial ecologies, ecosystem design. There are a lot of scientific disciplines that are situated in this space, still very much framed by let's call it high modern concepts, and neoliberalization of the inverted commas innovation that happens within them. I think that the idea of more open source and more Nikola Tesla like free energy style principles. So of course Edison transformed the idea of something that flows like electricity into something that could be unitized and measured, and therefore formed the basis of a capitalist system. But if we'd stuck with Tesla's notions of electricity, where we created, let's say, an electrical commons, which were shared by people, that provides a very different dynamic for thinking through this thing that we valorize called innovation. Because then you ask, who is innovation for? Right now, innovation tends to be funded by the state and profiteered by companies. and people miss out on the benefits of innovation because the companies don't give back their profits into the into the item. So it's a kind of a one-way flow from the state into a capitalist system which it's supporting, from which people, have no sense of commons. They're commons in terms of their ideas, the innovation, their investments into change, are not being recuperated in a way that is equitable. And so there are inequalities in the way that we're currently practicing innovation that I think need reconfiguring. So again, it's this idea of economics. Who is innovation for? Is innovation for communities? Or is innovation for companies to exploit, to create GDP, and therefore a small group of people make huge amounts of profits, and there is some trickle down through employing people to work in factories and offices and things. So, I mean, there are some tropes that are pretty fixed and fast, coming out of the late 20th century that really need challenging. And I do think that architecture is in a very good space to be able to start to work with alternatives, by building teams, by you were talking about, so what is the city of the future going to look like? Well, the city of the future could look very much like cities now, if we don't change our thinking and if we don't change the way that we work. But on the other hand, the city of the future could also be something much stranger, which has maybe some resonances with what we think are gardens and sewage plants, but not necessarily sewage plants presented in the way that we see them today, but maybe they are like greenhouses where, plant roots and their microbiomes are, acting like mangroves. And they're eating the stuff going in, but actually, because a lot of this is underground, you can walk through that park and it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like an old sewage farm that we know, but it actually looks more like a wetlands, for example. Yeah. Maybe there's a cafe there. And maybe, our homes, are more communal with private spaces and they feel more like parks, so that inside and outside is a bit more blurred. I think when you think through, let's call it a process of worlding, that cities could have different kinds of worlds within them, and worlds literally being, coherent units of inhabitation. So they could be as small as a jar in a biosphere where they're self-sustaining algae in a plant and some carbon dioxide and oxygen going on. And they could be as complex as the planet. So I think this idea of not just making buildings, not aiming for the object, but the idea of worlding a world as a fundamental practice of architecture, which means that you have to think about the politics, you have to think about the economics, you have to think about transport systems, you have to think about, which beings are being supported by this world. And I think it becomes then a multi-layered, multi-dimensional challenge where the old tools are very restrictive. And so the architect then is looking to build teams for worlding. And I think that in that sense, there is a great deal of power to transform cities. That the teams that have visions about, what the resources are and how people could and want to live within these spaces can be realized, within the carrying capacity of the lands that they're occupying, within the limits of the species that naturally live within these environments, whether there are alien species that want to, we can invite into these spaces. A lot of this will have many similarities with things like, immigration policies or international relations. Our relationship with plant life. Right now, we have this idea that alien invasive species, kind of create havoc in natural ecosystems, that are indigenous. And so we've kind of incorporated a lot of the language of colonialism into the way that we observe ecosystems. And I wonder whether more inclusive terminologies, where we're actually looking at the qualities and skills and opportunities and needs of certain ecosystems, we can help choreograph and garden that. And that, I think that language is actually really, part of, how we imagine the city of the future, the kinds of concepts that we start to articulate, the kinds of fears we have that we want to shut out, the kinds of freedoms we want to invite in. All of those will shape how we respond to that through, the design and implementation of a city and communities and homes. So I guess I don't want to be over deterministic about it, because I think that there is still a lot of potential, and certainly in the States, the power that is happening within cities and the role of the mayor in terms of setting the agenda for communities, I think is exciting, in the sense that there is a kind of a decentralization of power to a point, maybe not enough towards the people, but at the same time, it is change. And maybe we'll start seeing shifts of powers within cities, according to different programs and needs. And I think those would have to be very much negotiated. I don't think this is going to be about erasing what we already have. I think it's going to be in some ways about reprocessing, reconfiguring, reordering and reimagining what already exists, because that would be the most sensible and resource friendly way to go about things. But I think with the reconfiguring, there will be transformations. And in an ecological era, if we do deal with biodiversity and the diversity of people, and thinking about inclusive ways of living, that we could see kind of really nice forms of change, providing that we really deal with the power and resource inequalities that currently exist.
Wow. And that's a lot to unfold there. But you mentioned language, and I remember once that Wittgenstein said that the extent of language is the extent of your world. So why not try to expand it in a way that, as you say, doesn't only include more people, but includes our environment once again, which is weird to mention, right? We have to include our environment. We have to include nature, and it's a different way of thinking about life itself, about how we relate to our environment and how we relate to other people, and how does that translate into our systems, our abstractions. So that's amazing. And you mentioned industrialization, and I keep thinking that you raise a great point, that it seems that the 20th century keeps influencing the agenda of the 21st century. So the question is, has industrialization era accomplished its goal? And if yes, should we redefine what progress means? So that would be amazing to hear.
But I mean, one has to ask what that, whose goal is that? I mean, depending on who you ask, I mean, because if it is driven by greed, then industrialization's goal is really to exploit everything you can, under a capitalist system. Yeah. So I think these things are really entangled. So the industrialization and capitalism together has made a very toxic couple of bedfellows. Industrialization, I would say, under a different paradigm, may not have been as destructive as it is.
Wow, that's amazing.
But, for example, Tesla would be, Nikola Tesla would be a case point that if industrial scale entities were built so that naturally available sources of energy were redistributed through these great condensers, so that people could live according to the limits of the natural world, then the impacts from that would be much less than they are from mining for fossil fuels, for example, and with all the pollutants and the kind of geological issues that come with that. So I think industrialization, I think I do need to check what I mean by it, and what frameworks that we view the process in, because I don't think machines in themselves are bad. I mean, and I don't think that the Enlightenment reductive viewpoint of science, that specific, kind of, looking further downwards for answers, it's not bad in itself. When these things become coupled with certain values, they can be exploited in certain ways that reduce opportunities for others. And so I think we cannot dissociate science and technology from the socio-political environment in which it's emplaced. So I would like to give industrialization a get out of jail card, which is if it adopted another paradigm with different values and kind of different evaluative criteria, then perhaps we or I wouldn't be so critical of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned when I asked you about technologies, one of the biggest insights is that there are these technologies called soft technologies, right? Our own bodies, soil, and it's very interesting to have that in mind once we keep talking about artificial intelligence, transhumanism, like this. It seems like an obsession of the conversation that technology and robots and artificial intelligence needs to be synthetic, needs to be hardware, needs to be screens. But there are technologies that have been in the work for millennia of years. That is the earth. What can we learn from the earth? What is there for it to show us? And what is the legacy of it? How can we go back to that mindset? So what do you think should be our number one priority when it comes to redesigning, rethinking our living spaces?
What is the impact of the way we live on the space around us? I mean, does our presence create a net benefit for all, or is it creating defensive barriers and depleting vital resources that allows other things to thrive? So I think it's really a criteria of generosity and need. So that I think that we're used to taking, and I think that specifically in the Western culture, we take, we don't give back. We only give back waste. And if people can make value out of that, well, then good luck to them. So I think that when we're designing spaces, we really need to think about how well integrated it is into the established ecosystems, including the soil. So the fact that we rip, fertile soil out of the ground, is there another way that we might be able to, to achieve this, can the presence of a structure actually increase thriving? So if we look at, for example, some of the underwater sculptures and work by people like Colleen Flanagan that are emplacing, metal structures in the sea, and then you start to see coral growing on them. That's quite an interesting emplacement of structure in a space, because you think actually it's been able to encourage the flourishing of a community. So is there a practice of architecture that can do that? And it doesn't necessarily have to be pretty corals. I mean, even if it was enriching microbial environments, because the microbes are really the agents that have performed the work of worlding as we know it in terms of our planetary conditions. So it was the microbes in the Archean period that transformed the reducing gases of a volcanic earth, liquid, environment, wow, into oxygen enriched, which allowed the evolution of complex multicellular life. So it was the microbes that did that hard work. And it was Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock who started to respond to NASA's question, which was, how can we tell if other planets have life? And Lovelock said, oh, it's to do with disequilibrium. If a planet looks like it's out of equilibrium, so if you look at Venus and you look at Mars, actually they're pretty much in equilibrium. But actually, if you look at Earth, it's got both reducing and oxidizing gases present at the same time. So something's doing that work. It was Lynn Margulis who then said, it's the microorganisms doing that. And the planet is the way that it is because this work of Gaia is largely, some of it's carried out by rocks, but a lot of it is carried out by microorganisms. Wow. So they are really the primary workforce of the planet. And by inviting more of those, and less than 1% of all, it's even less than that, but less than 1% of all microbes are pathogens. And we've only, we discovered less than 1% of all the microbes on planet Earth. So there's an awful lot of technology out there. And J. Craig Venter, was fishing in the Sargasso Sea for microorganisms and came back with, more than 100 species, just after one trip. Now we have the technologies to be able to see these, amazing and ancient agents, these beings. I think there's a huge conversation and relationship that I think that we're at the very start of developing. So if I was going to make a prediction, I would say that maybe many of the tasks that we previously attributed to machines and fossil fuels going forward into the 21st century will start to be replaced by microbes, wow. If not fully.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's just thinking that way makes my mind blow, because as I mentioned, one of the biggest questions I have is our desire to keep having new software upgrades and hardware upgrades, but we often forget that, Earth was here before us and it'll most likely be here after us. So what does that mean for us when, now that you mentioned transhumanism, which piqued my interest a lot, what does it mean for us when we try to become an interplanetary species? How do we relate? How should we think of this particular idea if we go to Mars? How do we design Mars?
Okay, so my answer to that would be we wouldn't be doing it alone. So one of the kind of groundbreaking insights around about 2001 was this idea of the human microbiome. Previously, we've known that there are bugs in our guts. We know that there are microbes in our guts. Yeah. But with the advent of new sequencing technologies, we could start to sample microbial information on an ecological scale, and we were blown away by just how many microbes we carry. And so this idea of the human microbiome and its role in our health, and now we have to ask the question about our identity. And we know that if we don't have microbes, we'll get very sick. They produce molecules that regulate our mood, they help us eat our food, they help us make our skin supple. Lots and lots of things that the microbes help us, almost like an extra organ in our body do. Yeah. So if we were going to go to Mars and we didn't take our microbes with us, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And so if we have to take our microbes with us, we have to think about, well, how are they going to live? And under the Martian environment, will that subtle dynamic that exists on Earth change? So we know that when Salmonella goes to the ISS, the virulence goes up because wow. The reduction in pressure makes it think that it's time to replicate. So we have to think about what our microbes will do to our bodies when we're in physically altered environments. I think these are interesting questions because we know that even just on the ISS that our own physiology changes. We start to reabsorb our bones, we get more fluid in our tissues, we get eyesight problems because of radiation. So there's quite a lot that, is in dynamic balance. And now that we know that our microbes, are actually part of us, I'm not sure we can guarantee our relationship with them when we start going off world. But that's, and also, if we were going to thrive anywhere, if there was going to be human colonization anywhere, if we didn't have soil that was fertile, we won't live. We have to be able to make fertile soil first. So if you look at the moon, if you look at Mars, they're dusts and sands. They don't have any organic matter. They don't have any water in them. So, the idea of farming this, that, and the other, and whether we could do that just by hydroponics, I think hydroponics will give us a very limited biodiversity. And God knows what the plants are going to think about it, not only just living on water, but also living, under, challenging circumstances with reduced pressure and, reduced gravity and, oh, goodness knows, I think even micro variations in those factors, as far as we try and keep them stable, could have far-reaching effects. So I think that the issue of inhabiting other worlds, with our current knowledge and our current technology is still some way off, and there's a lot to learn. I think that we really do need to see, first of all, can we make a fertile lunar soil that will support a plant? We in some ways, why are we thinking about human colonization, human visitors? But let's try and grow a garden first.
Yes.
Let's see if we can get some, beetles and ants, and a bit like the Biosphere project, Biosphere 2 in Arizona. I mean, it's more like that kind of thing. Can we actually develop an ecology or a closed system ecology? I'm not sure that closed system ecologies work, but if we can't grow a biosphere on the moon, then why are we sending human there permanently? Why are we thinking about human colonization before we know that we can actually grow a biofilm? Let's say, can we grow a biofilm on the moon? That would be interesting, because moon's got challenges with minerals and water in the rocks, but microbes could probably get at that. And if we think about the way that our own planet moves forwards, it's by a lot of microbial colonization first. So I think if we actually thought of the first settlers, so Mars has an issue because of planetary protection, because we think that actually there may be native Martian bacteria there, maybe somewhere in the rocks, because we know that microbes live in the rocks here. So maybe that's not the first planet that we want to seed with microbes. But I think the moon might be fair game. I would love to see a rich lunar soil starting to grow the first little green plants. I still think that's a way off, but until we can do that, I think that the Gerard K. O'Neill visions of lunar colonies are still some way off.
Yeah, I'm trying to picture how would my night would look like if the moon would look green rather than white.
That would be awesome, actually. I think I could live with that.
Yeah. And it is quite astonishing that we can have these conversations, right? We can picture ourselves actually going to Mars or the moon and flourishing, our own definition or version of what nature is here on Earth, but extrapolate that to other planets. That's amazing. Before that, I would love to see us, taking into practice what we've talked about here in this conversation, that, I'd like to see Earth and humanity become one again, truly, truly permeated together, and not just isolated, buildings within a forest or cities that look just squared. See an intertwining, and collectively think that, we've accomplished a great deal of things here, and we're ready to move on rather than just building a new project outside the world without just finishing this one, if it can be finished. But it doesn't seem that we're very near that, I would say.
I think what's valuable about the space projects is it exposes some of the assumptions that we've made about nature. And I think the Biosphere 2 project really did that. We thought we had enough science and we thought we had enough understanding of ecology to be able to create a closed loop ecosystem, and we didn't. That isn't necessarily failure, it's an experiment, and it should have taught us a lot of stuff. And I think we need more of that kind of thing rather than less. So by using, let's say, different worlds to challenge our assumptions about the living world, different, extreme environments, I think that our knowledge becomes more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a value in, thinking about what might happen in space, because it removes a lot of the blind spots, makes us pay attention to things like gravity that we so take for granted. Atmosphere is another one, the wind blowing on our face. All of these would have to be synthesized, so that you can imagine that an off-world environment would actually be quite humid, because the regulation of water, air, and kind of solid would be a really difficult thing to be able to manage comfortably. Because it's so closed, and so a lot of these things, we're actually, on this giant cauldron that's, stirring oceans of air and oceans of lava, creating magnetic currents that are stopping us from losing our atmosphere to the sun's wind. And I mean, it's just an incredible physical environment that we inhabit. And I think, an appreciation of its complexity and kind of trying to, that's why I think this idea of worlding is nice, because trying to inhabit the sophistication of that kind of composition, I think, is going to teach us a lot. Even if we can't mimic and replicate it, I think, the insights that we will gain from it will reduce assumptions about things, help us value other things more, realize just what an incredible and unique environment we've been so lucky to inhabit, and maintain an honourable legacy and a livable legacy for those that come after us.
Yes, I very look forward to being, I don't know if I'll be a witness of it, but I'm looking forward that'll happen in the future. And tell me, so just trying to wrap up what has been a mind-blowing conversation, and as we've seen, architecture is not only about buildings, but thinking and rethinking what its role in our society, and moreover, how can politics, economics intertwine and acknowledge that we live in a complex system, and that it's been an insightful and very amazing conversation. So what is the project you're currently working on, or do you look forward to working on that excites you for the future?
All my projects are really exciting. So the one I've just been working on has been the Living Architecture project, which is sequencing bioreactors with different kinds of microbes in them so that they can process liquid waste within our home into usable resource. So electricity, fresh water, various forms of biomass. And so you can imagine a time where these liquid environments full of microbes can actually provide all the things that we use in the home right now. So from natural gas to electricity to drinking water. Wow. So at the moment we don't produce drinking water, but put a few filters in there and put the right technology in there, it's not unfeasible. So the idea of substituting fossil fuels for living microorganisms, because that's where fossil fuels come from, microorganisms and other life that died and got transformed by geology. But if we actually work with the living metabolisms, then actually they're more programmable. And so that's one of the projects. The next one is the ALICE project, which is a collaboration with Translating Nature and the University of West of England. And this is developing a biodigital interface which allows us to communicate with microbes. And so Julie Freeman's designing this inverse panopticon with augmented reality, where, you know, using a pad, we'll be able to see the microbe characters in our environment. So we can be aware of the invisible realm around us, and, you know, it's the beginning of establishing dialogues with it. Going forward, I am hoping to be able to transform this into urban scale interventions. So the idea of having gardens as power plants. So, you know, using the soils and the, you know, liquid wastes to produce bioelectricity at urban scale is certainly on the cards. So imagine getting rid of an electrical power station and replacing it with a garden, and that the fertile activity in that garden generates electricity that can power a phone, and provide street lighting. It also asks us, do we need 230 volts in every home? Can we live with a 12-volt system? If we do, what are the kinds of activities we need to reinvent? Washing machines, fridges? I don't think that's beyond us. But what it means is that the bioelectricity produced is produced by living things. It's looped into regenerative cycles. And so the impacts of bioelectricity as the, let's call it the vital infrastructure that powers our homes, is quite significant, because we tend to it and we can see how well it's doing because of the kinds of services that we can access. So trying to work with microbes at the urban scale is definitely on the cards, and probably other things. But so essentially, really working with this transition towards not just spaces, but the technologies themselves having an inner life, and conversing with those through our everyday activities. So conversations isn't really, like the microbial Alexa. It's more like that the microbe actually is a sensor and an effector, and it knows you. And so that your habituations, whether you leave your skin cells, whether you're carrying a virus, whether you're, excreting, sweat that has some, molecules that it mops up, all of that, how do we actually start to activate those spaces, and how do we make sense of this incredibly complex, invisible, kind of biological technology in which we're immersed, but our knowledge so far, hasn't been able to, let's say, really extend into its full capabilities.
Wow. I'm very excited to see that in the future, and also try to bring into the conversation of urban planning the role of biology that can have. It's really interesting. And Rachel, this has been a mind-blowing conversation. I'm sure that everyone who listens to it will be just impressed by how much are you doing in the field of architecture, not only that, in design, and just proposing new ways of thinking of things, and thinking of life that surrounds us, and what involves being, we talked about anthropocentric role in the world, humans being the leaders, and it seems that we could still be the leaders that said, if we're in this position, we can do something meaningful, and just take a step backwards and think, how can we be a net positive for the world, and stop trying to be takers. So really, thank you for this conversation. It was amazing. And is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I think the only thing I would add is that for all the young architects and designers out there, this is an incredible time to be in your field. There are a whole host of opportunities, and I think if you seize them, you'll definitely be thought leaders. I think, some wonderful enriching experiences await you.
Definitely. And for all of us who are not architects, we can just appreciate their ability to bring abstractions into reality and learn from them. And we can all be architects in some form of the future we have if we acknowledge everyone's position in it. Rachel, thank you so much for this. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
It's been great to meet you, Alex.
Thanks for tuning in for this edition of Through Conversations podcast. If you find this episode interesting, don't miss out on new conversations and subscribe to the podcast at any podcast feed you use and leave me a review. Also, consider sharing it with someone you think can enjoy this episode. Our new awesome music is by Joe Lyle. More info can be found at joelyledrums.com. Hosted and produced by Alex Levy.